Gostaríamos de registrar a presença de Denise Mota Dal, secretária municipal de Políticas para as Mulheres de São Paulo, representando o prefeito Fernando Haddad, Cláudio Scheffer, secretário adjunto de Segurança Urbana da cidade de São Paulo, Guilherme Canella, conselheiro de Comunicação e Informação da Unesco, e de José Barbosa, gerente de Relacionamento Comunitário da Petrobras. Bom, agora, na sequência do seminário, nós teríamos a palestra de abertura, né, que seria ministrada pela ministra Carmen Lúcia Antunes Rocha. Infelizmente, ela teve um imprevisto, né, e não poderá, pelo menos até o presente momento, não conseguiu chegar. Então, nós vamos adiantar, né, vamos dar início, então, à palestra 1, intitulada Panorama Global das Culturas de Violência contra as Mulheres. Nessa palestra, né, será apresentada uma análise sobre a prevalência da violência por parceiro íntimo em diferentes países. E, para ministrá-la, nós convidamos Lori Heise, professora titular da London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine.
Good morning. I apologize that I don't speak your lovely language, so I fear you all have to put on your devices. I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak with you today, and to say just a bit about where I come from, what my background is. I have worked for over 30 years in the movement as a feminist, working on violence against women. More recently, I've come, though, to start working on research to try to understand more about the culture of violence, about its causes. I felt frustrated after 30 years of working that we hadn't made more progress. And while I believe that the services and the laws that we have passed are absolutely essential, perhaps more important, what we need to turn our attention to is how to dismantle the causes of violence so that we can create generations of young girls and boys who have totally different expectations about opportunities of the way they conduct relationships. So I'm the only person who I think is going to show you data. If you like data, that's great. If you don't, I apologize. Oops, somehow we've gone back. One of the things I wanted to do, though, is just to tell you a bit about what we have learned in the last 20 years about the nature of violence and about how to prevent it. So one of the things that we have learned is that partner violence, so violence within intimate relationships, is the dominant form of abuse that women suffer across the world. And that's true even in settings of humanitarian crises or conflict, where we focus a lot on sexual violence by combatants and the like. If you actually do research in those settings, those very same women that have been victimized by state agents or militaries actually have experienced more violence from their intimate partnerships than they have from the military conflict. We've also learned that the health consequences of violence go way beyond injury. People often think about injury and the physical violence, but actually we now know that the trauma and fear and the stress that accompanies women living in these relationships has long-term health impacts that actually put them at risk throughout their lifetime for all sorts of things, from cardiovascular disease to negative sexual and reproductive health outcomes, and even influences their children. So women who are pregnant and are abused during pregnancy have a greater likelihood of having low birth weight infants, which means that those children are actually at higher risk of dying. The other thing we know is that violence overlaps a lot, and we tend to traditionally talk about types of violence, physical violence or sexual violence. And actually what we really need to be looking at is the burden of violence that women experience across their life course, because we don't just experience one type or even one event, that frequently women who have been victimized in the past are actually at more risk of being victimized in the future. Now, one thing that is incredibly important, though, that we've learned only in the last 5 years is that violence is actually preventable. And one of the things we used to say, people would say, oh, it's so deeply ingrained. It's such a big problem that we can't actually do anything about it. And what we have now is a handful, and we're just beginning, but a handful of studies where we've demonstrated, using the highest kind of gold standard research that researchers look for, that we've been able to reduce rates of violence significantly in 3 to 5 years. So as an example is this program in Uganda. It's called SASA, which means stop in Swahili. It's a community mobilization approach where community members are trained as activists. And it's based on theory and has shown that they were able to reduce the rates of partner violence by over half, by 52% in 3 years. Another program in Kenya called Ujamaa is training young girls in self-defense and women's empowerment. And again, if you look at the girls who receive the training compared to girls randomized to receive the training later, the girls who receive the training actually experience 62% less rapes in the 10 or 11 months after the training. A third one, and this is just to give you an example of the type of progress we're working in terms of thinking about how to prevent violence. This one is just an issue of a social protection program to try to alleviate the stresses of poverty. Here, they actually are giving money directly to households, assuming that households can figure out how best to use that cash. And what they found is that these unconditional cash transfers reduce physical violence by 50% and also sexual violence in these relationships by 50 to 60%. So I show you these examples just to say that prevention is possible within the kinds of time frames that we try to actually work on projects and try to improve people's lives. Now, another message that I think is very important is that the levels of violence actually vary a lot amongst settings. I don't know if you can actually see this well, but what this is data from a study we did about 10 years ago now. And it's the World Health Organization multi-country study on domestic violence and women's health. And what you see, and I just kind of wanted to show that in 2 settings, we did one in Yokohama, Japan, a study, and then in Serbia, in Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. There you see that 3.7% of women experience physical or sexual violence by their partner within the last year. Now compare that to this one here, where over half of women, and that's in a rural district in Ethiopia. If you want to see Brazil, we did this study with colleagues here in the room and at the university here, in both São Paulo and in Pernambuco. So it was a household representative sample survey. And what we see is that within São Paulo, the average rate of violence that women experienced in the last 12 months was 9.3%. And in Pernambuco, the whole state, the average across the state was 14.8%. So that gives you a sense of the range that we're seeing. But even more important than the difference between countries is that we see the same differences, the same geographic differences within countries. So here what I'm showing you is actually data from São Paulo. And what this data are, what those bars are, is it's basically across the bottom of the graph. It goes from none to less than 20% to 20 to 29%, all the way up to 70%. And that's the percentage of women that were abused in neighborhoods, in specific neighborhoods. So what you see in this graph is that there were about 6.5% of the neighborhoods in São Paulo, women were not abused at all within the last year, 0%. Whereas in the top, about 9 or 10%, I think it's, yeah, I can't read it from here, but 8.9% of women experience in those neighborhoods, more than 40 to 50% of women were abused. And so what you see is that there's a huge variation. And if we put on this same graph, our Pernambuco, the state of Pernambuco, you see the same type of curve, but it's just shifted a little bit to the right. So there's less women that are experiencing less neighborhoods with no violence, and more neighborhoods with very high rates of violence. Now, that leaves us with a really interesting question. What is it about those neighborhoods or those settings across the world, or even here within São Paulo, that makes it so that you have some places where no one is abused and some places where 70 or 80% of women in that neighborhood are abused? And that's what I've spent my time researching for the last 5 or 6 years. It also shows us that it is possible to construct societies and material realities in such a way that actually women aren't abused at high rates, which gives me great hope. What we need to do is interrogate that to try to understand what insights we can pull in order to design intervention programs to bring down the rates of violence in those settings where they're very high. So one of the things I think it's really important when thinking about prevention is to get our thinking right about causality. Because we oftentimes get into big debates in the women's movement about, does alcohol cause violence? Is gender inequality the cause of violence? And what I do as someone coming from health is that type of thinking is what I call infectious disease thinking. Okay, so infectious diseases are caused by a single factor. One factor is necessary and sufficient. So if I have the HIV virus, I have HIV disease. If I get the flu virus, I get the flu. But actually, a better way to think about the causes of violence is actually to think of what I call the heart disease model of violence. So this poor chap here, he has a lot of things that are going against him. He smokes, he eats Big Macs, he's obese, he has diabetes. These are all risk factors to increase his likelihood that he may have heart disease. Not any single one of those is deterministic in the sense that if you smoke, you will get heart disease. We all have those uncles that smoke their whole lives and nothing bad ever happened to them. And that's actually because it's multi-causal. It's a problem that has many overlapping causes. And that is exactly the way we need to think of violence. So if we think about it, let me offer you a model of a way to think about it. So we start with the man, right? And the man is coming to his relationships. He has a certain genetic endowment, certain proclivities. He has a history, what happened to him in his childhood, how he developed. Did he have good parenting? Did he have harsh parenting? He also has his own set of beliefs and attitudes that he's picked up and been socialized through, and behaviors. Maybe he drinks, maybe he doesn't drink. He then is matched with a woman, right? They come together, and she has the same thing. She has her own gender socialization, her own developmental history. And they also have a relationship which has different kinds of dimensions. And some of the factors that we know are linked to higher risk of violence is if they don't communicate well, for example, if there's a lot of sources of conflict in this relationship. But that relationship is actually embedded in a community, and that community has beliefs and norms. And oftentimes, those are from what we call the macro structure. So, in effect, we live with institutions, whether they be religious institutions, whether they be the cultures of honor, consumerism, the different gender regimes in which we live. All of those things filter down to influence that couple. And one of the things that happens then is that they have certain things that cause conflict in their relationship. And with partner violence, what we've recognized is that frequently the things that cause conflict go to triggers around gendered expectations. So if the woman, for example, doesn't come home, have dinner ready on time, or if she has disobeyed her husband in a setting where men are considered the authority, that can be an excuse or a trigger for violence. So that gives you one way to think about it. And it's important that we realize that we need to look at both what puts individual women at higher risk of violence, but also what drives levels of violence in a population. Because see, I come from public health, and my job is to try to reduce violence overall in a population. It's just too hard to try to save women one at a time. So what we need to do is figure out what can we implement to try to shift that whole curve that we saw between São Paulo and Pernambuco, so that there's more and more neighborhoods that don't have high rates of violence. So these are just a few of the factors that research has shown are important for individual women's risk. One of the things that we see for both women and men that's highly associated and very strongly, there's a lot of causal evidence, is that if you are abused yourself in childhood, or you've been harshly punished, or even if you've grown up and witnessed violence, you are at much higher risk of being a victim of violence yourself or perpetrating violence. And it's not automatic. Remember, we're not back in the idea that any one thing causes violence. So the vast majority of people who are abused as children don't go on to abuse. But of those that do abuse, the vast majority have abuse in their own background. Another thing we see is that you're at much higher risk if you're young. So probably for women, that's probably because young men tend to be more violent than older men, and they tend to partner with men that are closer to their own age. We see in terms of protection that women who have completed at least secondary education are at lower risk of violence. And unfortunately, it doesn't really kick in, that protective effect doesn't kick in until you've actually entered tertiary or finished secondary. So our goals around getting girls in school, we really need to focus on keeping girls in school. So if we think about partners, they also have very much similar things. Violence in childhood. In high-income countries, the same men that abuse their wives have a lot of other, what we would call antisocial behavior, so they're involved in a lot of other crime. They are often frequently violent against other men. And there's also a really strong association with drinking, with alcohol. And alcohol is something that potentiates the situation, right? So we know that it increases the frequency and the severity of violent events in couples. Now, if you look at the ones that I've circled here, all of these things, these attitudes and beliefs around acceptability of wife beating, or the notions about male authority in the household, together with high use binge drinking and some of those things, all of that can be linked to certain kinds of notions and constructions of masculinity and what it means to be a man. So this I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of those attitudes, because certain cultural beliefs, and I work mostly in low and middle income countries, so this is from the WHO multi-country study, and we have a question in there, and we ask women about, well, do you think that a man has a good reason or is justified to beat his wife if you do, and then a series of different questions. If you disobey him, if you don't take care of the children, if he thinks you may be having an affair. And I've just put a couple up here so that you can see the variation. So if you look at in Peru, in Cusco province in Peru, 46% of women say, yes, a man has the right to beat his wife if I disobey him. They make distinctions by reason, though. So only 25.8% say that it's okay for him to beat me if I refuse him sex. So it's interesting, by setting, people have certain rules, certain cultural beliefs about when is it okay and when is it not. Now, if you look at Ethiopia, rural Ethiopia, there almost 78% of women believe that it's appropriate for men to beat their wife if they disobey. Fortunately, here in Brazil, some of those attitudes have changed a lot. So in Brazil, we see that only 11% of women believe that it's okay if she disobeys, and only around 5%, 4.7%, believe it's okay for a man to beat his wife if she refuses sex. But you can imagine that if you're in a setting where that very high percentage of men and women believe not only is it okay, but it's a man's obligation to discipline his wife, that you're going to have much higher rates of partner violence. So one of the things we've been doing is trying to look at what predicts this geographic distribution, right? So why is it high in one place and low in another place? And to do that, we use a technique called an ecological analysis. And what's different about this is, instead of asking, why is this particular woman being beaten, it asks the question, does this population or this setting have this particular level of partner violence? And one of the things I just completed, in fact, it's coming out today. So if you're interested, it's in the Lancet Global Health, which is available online. It's a journal. And what we did is we actually looked at the issue around women's status and gender inequality and norms to test whether or not actually women's status and gender inequality and things predicted levels of violence across different settings. We've always said that gender and gender inequality is really key, but we've never actually had the data to prove it. And now what we have is we actually can show that across the board, if you look at what predicts it, the strongest predictors of the levels of violence in different settings are women's lack of economic rights or entitlements, gender discrimination and family law, so that means places where women may lose custody of their children, don't have maintenance, all of those things you can imagine make it much harder or much less likely that a woman will leave an abusive relationship. We also see that discrimination and access to property. So in those settings where women have less access to either land or other types of property, rates of violence are higher. The other thing that comes out really strongly is this notion of norms, okay? So the cultural expectations. So where it's acceptable, not surprisingly, where it's acceptable for men to beat their wives, you have much higher levels of violence. And also where the expectation is that men will control female behavior. So where there's expectations of male authority over men, we see very strong associations with levels of violence. So one of the things that's really important to realize, and we don't think about this a lot, is that the same factor can operate differently at different levels of that model that I shared with you, that ecological model. So for example, in many countries, throughout all of Africa and then some other parts of the developing world, women who are employed are actually at higher risk. And they're especially at higher risk if they're in the vanguard, if they are the first, or they're starting to work or entered the workforce or starting to have income, and most of the women in their community don't. But we know that if we're looking across different countries, that one of the things that predicts low levels of violence at a country level is the proportion of women who are in the formal workforce. So what we see is we almost have to get through that eye of the needle. So the violence may go up first because women are actually going against the grain, the expectations, the cultural and the gendered expectations. But that once enough women are employed, violence rates go down. So it's very important to recognize how these things work. So I just wanted to say really quickly something about the models and what we've learned works in terms of prevention. And I just go back real fast. There's sort of key elements that we're starting to extract of what you need to put in place if you're trying to reduce violence at a population level or in a particular community. So I'm going to take you real fast through what those look like. The first one I call the capacity to aspire, or you could just call it hope. I mean, in the different places where I've worked around the world, you find that women are in one of three spaces. You come into a community, and sometimes the women have totally internalized the cultural idea that they are to blame. And they say, yes, I should be beaten if I've done something wrong, and there's nothing we can do about it. Sometimes you go into a community, and women, they know that it's not right, they think it's not fair, but they don't think there's anything they can do about it. And sometimes you go into a community that's politically organized, and they say it's not right and it's not fair, and together we can do something about it. And you almost have to take groups of women through that process first, because if the women themselves don't have the ability to envision a life without violence, it's going to be very hard to make progress. The next thing we've learned is something you here in Latin America have known for millennia, which is the power of popular experiential education. And here what we know is that it's not good just to have workshops. You need to take people through a process where they learn critical reflection skills that teach and how to think, how to have a political analysis of a problem. And also that avoid finding a point of entry that avoids demonizing men actually has been very helpful. We use, in Africa and in Asia, we started talking about women's rights, and frequently at a community level, that closed people up. The women started defending the men. But if we started to talk about, for example, power, and how do people use power, and how has power been abused against you as a man, and then how do you use your power, it starts a conversation where people end up in the same place with the same analysis, but they've done the analysis. And so they're much more accepting of it. Another thing we've recognized, and this has been more recent, is that we actually have to give people skills. If you look at programs at work, whether you're trying to help young women avoid unwanted pregnancies, or you're trying to stop gang violence, or you're trying to work with domestic violence, you need to give people skills to be a different way. And with the domestic violence, frequently that's skills related to communication, skills related to managing triggering events, and things which will help them, if it's, for example, if it's disciplining children. If you beat your children and that's all you know, you need a skill about how do you do positive discipline. And finally, one of the things we've learned is that we have to move beyond working with individual groups of people. We know that if we work with a group of people, whether that be boys and men, or women and girls, or faith leaders, we can actually see a lot of change in those people, but it doesn't diffuse. It doesn't actually go that much beyond the people that you work with, unless you plan that and you have an organized way to diffuse that throughout a community. And we are now at a point where we're actually able to achieve changes at a population level in a community, even among people that never had contact with the program. And that's the kind of change that we need if we're going to achieve long-term our goals of stopping violence. And finally, and again, this is something that I don't need to tell this audience, is the power of collective action. So it's not enough just for individual women to feel empowered. We need to make this a political issue, and it's clearly already a political issue here in Latin America. That's not the case, though, in everywhere that I work. And so helping people move from individual empowerment to collective organizing is a really big, important part of the puzzle. So finally, just a few final thoughts on things which I think we might want to think of differently as we go forward in planning where we put our energy. One is at the macro level. We've spent decades now putting laws in place and trying to criminalize violence, but we haven't actually focused, interestingly enough, on some of the things that are coming out from the analysis as most related to levels of violence. So even more related than the law around domestic violence is the laws around property, maintenance, child custody, and inheritance. And I don't actually know where that stands here in Brazil, but I think it's really important that we think about that as movement people. I also think we have to become more sophisticated in how we think about changing norms. So norms are absolutely key, but sometimes you need to, what we've learned is that kind of generic campaigns generally is not enough. You need to identify the specific set of norms and attitudes that are driving, what is the belief system? And you need to attack them very creatively. And we can talk if people are interested about how you do that. But here I just put two quotes because one of the things that's driving violence, especially in rural, indigenous, and some of the lowest income settings, is this idea of men having the right to discipline female behavior. So here you have an indigenous woman in Mexico who says, well, I think that if the wife's guilty, then her husband has the right to hit her. If I've done something wrong, nobody should defend me. But if I haven't done something wrong, I have a right to be defended. It's even more stark in Tamil Nadu in India, where he says, well, if it's a great mistake, then the husband is justified in beating his wife. Why not? A cow will not be obedient without beatings. And that's a logic you hear over and over and over again. And so part of what you have to do if you're working in a setting like that is deconstruct that particular concept of the man's right for what set of reasons. Finally, I think we need to aim much younger. And I think as women's movement people, we've been reluctant to do this because we don't want to take the attention off of women and place it all on children. But what I've learned as I've really focused on prevention is they're one and the same problem. Because violence against children is a core driver of violence against women. And we need to find common cause around that. And the final one, which is also very, very controversial in the women's movement, is the role of alcohol. Because we've always been afraid to talk about alcohol because it would somehow give an excuse to perpetrators for their behavior. But I've become convinced, and I think the evidence really is very convincing, that alcohol really does potentiate this problem. And if we're about trying to keep women safe, we can show, and there are settings where if you can reduce levels of binge drinking or even the availability of alcohol in a community, rates of domestic violence go down. So I challenge us to look at some of our assumptions and to try to actually be open to new ways of fighting this scourge as we together try to deconstruct the culture of violence. So for those who are interested, there's a special edition of The Lancet that it just came out like 2 months ago, of a whole overview of the global situation, as well as other materials that you can see on these websites. And I thank you for the great opportunity to speak with you today. Thanks.